this is the Harbor Freight Model 67781 flat panel TV wall mount. It can be used for the larger TVs. You got to watch your weight limitations when you get to the larger plasma stuff, but it's an all steel mounting system, and it's one that I actually prefer to use. I've got a client who bought one of these other ones at Brown Tilting, whatever, having to return it to the store because I really do think this one's better. And it's a good heavy duty steel mount, no frills, but it does what it needs to do. This here is one of the Sony Vizio 70-inch TVs. Really big, and the way all these mounts work is you'll get the bar part that goes on the wall. So we're just going to carefully set that over to the wall right now. And then we usually get some kind of packet of screws and bolts. We would find which ones correspond to a particular TV. Usually they're all metric. You're always going to have screws and bolts left over. That's normal. And then we have the little spacers. And on these, I always use the widest spacers that come with the kit. On this particular one, they're only coming with one size. If for some reason my screws and bolts weren't long enough or something else was going squirrely, I tend to save the extra spacers and screws and bolts from other installation kits and occasionally end up with a few of these that are unopened because I'm using the parts from other kits. The bars are relatively standard to the industry, but what you'll notice about the ones with a Harbor Freight system as opposed to a lot of what else is out there, the pivot point is biased over to what is the low end when this thing is mounted. That's what gives you a little bit more tiltage to get this thing out from the wall. But what happens is you've got your slots and you've got your long slot. So really what happens, most of your weight, your load bearing is at the upper end of that. So when we mount other brands of mounts on the wall, and the way this one's set, both ends actually are load bearing members. This thing here, when it goes up on the wall, is biased a little bit low. So we have to keep that in mind when we're doing it. Don't be surprised if, even if you're a little bit experienced at these things, you may have to be pulling that off the wall and repositioning it in order to get the TV at the desired height. Here in this situation, we need to make sure the TV clears this cabinet with a sound bar attached to it, and we want it to otherwise end up pretty close. So, we're going to do some careful measuring, but this isn't something where you're likely to end up within a millimeter on the first application. And I do kind of like to get the TV up off the wall a little bit, off whatever the furniture stuff is, because the screens are delicate, and if somebody sets something on that table and it tilts toward the TV, you could have a problem. The other limiting factor that you can run into on these installations is where the pre-existing holes in the walls are for any wire or cable runs. So in this instance, it's a brand new house, but for some reason they didn't put the cable conduit in with these. So we're going to fish the cables through on that, but that's not really part of the Harbor Freight wall mount, which I'm going to have as its own video. So what we've done here is we took the packing screws out of the back of the TV. Now usually these TVs aren't going to come with packing screws, but on this one it came with packing screws. So with those in hand, we check and we see what size these correspond to on our kit. And as I look at these, they seem like they're a little bit smaller than the thickest screw, so it's probably these. And what we're going to do is I'll pop those out of the kit, and then we put these spacers go up against the TV. You notice only the Harbor Freight kit seems to use these, but what it does is when we pinch that in with a screw, it spreads that force out a little bit so that it's not forcing its way into the back of the TV and crushing the plastic. So it's kind of a little improvement over the ones that are usually just a straight cylindrical spacer. So hold up. So what we do is the washers on these were a little bit, they were too large is what happened. So I pulled some washers out of another kit to get that to go. Obviously we want these two consistently, and because it's a kind of a slider thing without a direct hole, we want to make sure that these are both settled down before we put the lower one in. And then because we're usually having to get the lower one around in some of this hardware, you put it up here and then lower it down. And then if it's a little tricky to reach in there with a screw gun, go ahead and see if we can tighten that up. If it's a little tricky to reach in there with a screw gun, you may have to get it with a hand screwdriver, which isn't the end of the world, because you've got to be very, very delicate with a screw gun on these things. Don't just, break out the 18-volt DeWalt hammer drill and crank it down really hard. So as he does this, he's going to be really light touch on that trigger. We're not using a P108 battery in this. We're using one of the lighter weight deals. And we may end up...
Yeah, you're gonna need a screwdriver.
Yeah, we're going to do that with a hand screwdriver. So even said, when I hit these with the power tool, we just go very, very light with that. As soon as it starts impacting, you're done. And optimally, you could use a lower powered one. It's just that when I get to the point that I'm using an impact to get the main lag bolt into the wall, you got to have some power for that. So after some measuring, we want to make sure we have the TV high enough that it's going to clear everything, and then but this does bias on the lower end of that. So the way this goes, if you look and feel back here, you'll know there's at least one big stud. Use a big lag bolt on that stud. What a lot of these kits come with are these. These just kill walls, so I really prefer not to use them. So I put one in, cinch it down relatively tight, level it, and then I'm going to put lighter weight screws all along here with their own little drywall anchors. And for that, you're better off using a larger number of smaller screws than you are using like the big 4 things at 4 corners and then not hitting a stud in the middle. You really want to hit a stud when you do this. Don't be overly worried about your left-right bias on this. You can adjust the TV once it's up there. Just make sure you're within a couple inches of where you want to be, and make sure you're level. So what I really like for this application are these twist and lock drywall anchors. Now they're small, okay, which means we're not doing big honking holes in the drywall, but they have 50 pounds of holding power each, and you've got to use them with a fender washer to hold that up. And you got to use a bunch of them, but what it does, it spreads the any kind of pulling force or weight distribution, it spreads it out. And so no single one of those is going to hold this thing up. But don't forget, we had that big lag bolt in the middle that's in a stud, and you only need one in a stud to hold something like this. The rest of it can be on these anchors, but you've got to have some anchors, because the lag bolt alone, if everything's pulling by that, would distort the metal frame over time. But each one of those has about 50 pounds of holding force. So with 8, 9 of them in there, we've got several hundred pounds of holding force. It's never going to be a problem. And what I really like is it cinches them up to the wall. Cinches it up to the wall nice and tight.